I will be talking about how to craft the research question. So if any of you either are thinking about doing research or have actively been involved in research, have ever wondered why on earth am I doing this, you're not alone. It's a challenging process, but I just wanted to kind of bring us back to the why. And good research guides good clinical decisions that affect the outcomes and the health of our patients. Good research fuels the continuous improvement process, and it's critical to improving outcomes. Poorly conducted research is as harmful as, if not more than, poor medical practice. And it's important to remember that good research follows scientific guidelines that protect patients and help produce reliable results. And it does not need to be as complicated as you might think. So really the most basic principle of learning how to perform clinical research is simply to know how to ask questions. And as clinicians caring for complex patients, we do this every day, even without knowing it. And so this inquisitive mindset will really drive the formation of your question. And it is within this mess of lines here between problem and solution where really the research process takes place, and it all starts with coming up with a good question. Next slide. So the basics, a good research question should really address or have at least one of the following problems. Either the existing literature yields conflicting results, the evidence is either non-existent or scarce, and or the result could be improved. So if your question doesn't have any of these problems, then it might not be a question worth asking. There might already be answers out there. A good question focuses on what is unknown or unclear and what requires further validation and exploration. So before you start, it's really important to understand your timeline, resources, obstacles, and environment. Do you have the right team? Collaboration with experts, colleagues, experts in your field of interest, whether that be clinicians, epidemiologists, analysts. Next, and do you have the right environment? So institutional support is absolutely critical. If you don't have either the financial support, the administrative support, it's really difficult to perform clinical research, and that should really help to shape the kind of question and kind of research that you plan to embark upon. And then I cannot underscore, I think that everyone would agree that they wouldn't be where they are, or they wouldn't be heading to where they want to go without the presence of research mentors. Dr. White and Dr. Morris are two of and Dr. Majersic, who's not in the room, but these surgeons have been incredible mentors for me, and I would not be sitting here without their ongoing encouragement and support. So if you can kind of think about all of those things before you start, that's really important. How do I start? So generally a good question comes from a clinical dilemma. And next, ensuring a grounded interest in the topic is extremely important. As we can all imagine, research can be challenging, whether it be the hoops and obstacles we have to jump through, whether it be changing protocol based on issues that were unforeseen. I really believe that if you're interested in the topic, this will help keep you moving forward. Next, it's important to perform a detailed literature review. You want to map out the contemporary debates and critiques around the topic so that you understand what is the current landscape of the topic that you're interested in. Because remember, a good question should address an important gap in knowledge, and if that gap doesn't exist, you may want to reword or redirect your question. And you want to develop sub-questions around that topic. Often we have kind of broader questions, and if you can really focus in on the sub-levels and subtopics that are embedded within a topic, that's often where you will find the specific research question that's actually answerable. And remember that findings will only be relevant if they answer a specific question. So you don't want to go through all the work and then realize that you haven't really come up with reliable and relevant results. So the finer criteria, this is pretty well documented and published, and if anyone likes acronyms, this is a good one. This is kind of a roadmap that helps make sure that your question kind of checks all these boxes. So feasible, interesting, novel, ethical, and relevant. And if you like an acronym, this is a good one. Next, I just decided to provide kind of my own version of the nuts and bolts and what I think is helpful. I couldn't really create an acronym, but hopefully this will be a good guide to creating the question. So next, so first we'll focus on focused and specific. Very basic. You just want to make sure that the idea isn't too big and that it's narrow enough that it can be answered thoroughly in the space allowed. And when I talk about space allowed, that's referring to those resources, your institutional support, your environment, your teamwork. And it's critical to be specific and to use well-defined concepts within the question. And we'll go over some examples at the end of the talk. But the more specific you can be in the question, the more answerable it will be. Next. Measurable. This might seem kind of obvious, but you know, when animals attack, as Dr. Morse mentioned, doesn't really have a measurable component to the question. And so we want to make sure that the question has a measurable component and that it can be answered using data, whether that be, you know, numerical or survey data, whatever, you know, whatever it may be. Just you want to make sure that the question has a measurable component. Clear and concise. You want to avoid a confused research process and don't want to be too vague. Muddled questions lead to muddled methodology, lead to muddled results, which aren't really that impactful. So you want to try to state your question using the fewest words possible and provide enough specifics in that question that the audience or the readers or your collaborators or whoever can easily understand its purpose without needing additional explanation. And I think there's a talk later on primary and secondary outcomes that all kind of ties into the question. A pretty easy way to do this and a good place, you know, to start would be to modify your target population. So, you know, rather than looking at all patients with rib fractures, you might want to focus in on those with clinical flail or non-flail. So, you know, just kind of honing in on your target population will help. And then just remember that a question that is too elaborate may hide concepts that are not relevant or that may be worth their own question, their own research process. Feasible. So as you can probably tell, these are all related. A question cannot be feasible if it's not focused or specific or clear or concise. And so the question should be within the scope and the scale at your fingertips and answerable within your practical constraints. Can the data be accessed or collected within your time limitations and resources? And if the answer is no, then you need to go back to focused and specific. How can we hone in on a more focused and more specific question that is actually answerable within your practical constraints? Looking at, you know, trial design is obviously related to feasibility. What is required of executing a randomized control trial is completely different than a retrospective review or even a prospective, you know, single cohort design. And so you want to tie the appropriate design to your study question in order to achieve feasibility. And if your results aren't feasible, they're not going to be reliable. Arguable, I think this is important. The potential answers to your question should be open to debate rather than accepted facts. And the question should really provide space for debate and deliberation and discussion and interpretation. And if that's not the case, then again, there probably is that knowledge gap that we talked about being so critical to your question. And then last but not least, in the talk that we heard from earlier on, you know, the Delphi method in terms of relevance, I think that's an awesome approach. And when you're engaging fellow experts, colleagues, to kind of hone in on what is relevant to your field and of interest, you know, to others, you know, that will really produce a good question. If it's not relevant, no one's going to read it, and you know the results won't be impactful. So you want to produce knowledge that future researchers can build upon. The question, you know, as I mentioned earlier, should arise from your clinical practice, and so therefore, by nature, as medical providers, you know, this is not hard to kind of hit. This bullet point is relevance, especially if the question comes from our practice. You want to establish a clear purpose for your research. And then regarding originality, is there room for investigation in this area? I don't think it means that you have to come up with a brand new idea. I think we can all agree that there are multiple papers answering, you know, kind of general similar questions. But there should be something about your question and your design that has some aspect of originality. And so whether that's tweaking the study population or the intervention or the time, something about your question should be original so that it's actually adding to the existing literature. So I just have a few examples. Just these aren't necessarily really great ones, but ones that I came up with. And I'm kind of assuming that we've already hit the boxes of relevant, original, and arguable. And I want to focus on being more focused and specific, more clear and concise. So a good example, or a good question, should all patients with multiple rib fractures undergo SSRF? Well, there might be some comments in the audience about that. If we can make that more of a specific question and change it to, in trauma patients with non-flail severe rib fractures, does SSRF improve numeric pain scores and quality of life compared to non-operative management? This is obviously not my own question. This was recently published by CWIS, but as you can see, it's more focused and more specific on the patient population, and then more clear and concise, measurable in terms of the outcomes. Next. What are the best parameters for chest tube removal in patients hospitalized with hemothorax, and how long does the patient need to be monitored after removal? Well, that's a great question. There's kind of a couple questions in there. A better way to kind of make this more of a measurable question would ask for acute hemothorax after trauma managed with tubular. Does increasing 24-hour output from less than 150 to less than 250 as a threshold for removal result in an increased complication or failure rate? So now kind of introduce a measurable component, more clear and concise, and there's really no questions about what are you asking. A good question. Since we have become the geriatric ground level service, how do we better manage these old people so we can discharge them sooner and minimize hospital complications? I feel like we ask ourselves this every day, but what would be a better way to actually find an answer to this reasonable question? In elderly patients, does the implementation of a trauma-specific frailty index and pathway reduce hospital length of stay and 30-day readmission rates? So now you've kind of turned a very general question into something much more specific, measurable, feasible, clear and concise. And then next, we can skip this one. There's one more. So my last one is, when is it safe to fly after traumatic pneumothorax? For our colleagues here in Utah and Colorado, this question comes up all the time. And we actually kind of narrowed this down to a more specific question a few years ago and published a paper where we asked, will patients in simulated flight conditions immediately after acute treatment for traumatic pneumothorax experience cardiopulmonary signs or symptoms or have radiographic enlargement of their pneumothorax? A little bit wordy, but this actually was feasible for us. We have a hypobaric chamber, and so we were just able to kind of introduce into this question, again, measurable components, hone in on the patient population, and this is an answerable question. And that is it. Thank you so much, everyone, for the opportunity to speak. I definitely feel like a little fish in a big pond, and it's an honor to be a part of this group.